This is our trip to Havasu Canyon in April 2019. We hiked down to the bottom of the Grand Canyon and camped for 2 nights. Normally, when you think of the Grand Canyon, you're thinking of the national park over here. But Havasu Canyon is over here on the Havasupai Reservation. If you're camping, you stay in the campground 2 miles past the village of Supai. The campground is on a creek, and it's right next to some of the waterfalls you came to visit. You can also stay in a lodge in the village, but then you've got an extra 2-mile hike to everything you came to see. It's about a 12-mile hike from the trailhead down to the campground, so we stayed at the closest hotel, which isn't that close, in Peach Springs the night before. That's in the Hualapai Reservation. So on the morning of Easter Sunday, we had breakfast at the hotel and packed up our backpacks. There was a lot to fit in those backpacks, but we were determined to make it work. Then we headed out to the trailhead. From Peach Springs, it's 60 miles down Indian Road 18 to the trailhead, which is called the Hualapai Hilltop. There's no fresh water at the trailhead, so pack that before you go, and leave some in the car for your drive out. When you get close to the trailhead, there's a security checkpoint where they check your reservation and your permit. They also checked our IDs matched the permit and inspected the car for alcohol because no alcohol is allowed on the reservation. By the time we got to the hilltop, it was about 10 a.m., and since it was Easter Sunday, it was pretty crowded. We had to park almost a mile from the start of the trail, but we figured with so much hiking to do, we wouldn't notice an extra mile. At the hilltop, there's a helicopter pad for people who want to fly in. It takes you down into the village, but most people hike, and you can pay for a mule to take your bags, but we carried everything ourselves, and from what we saw on the way down, the vast majority of people paid for the mules to carry their bags. If you're looking online about making this trip, there are a lot of people talking about the horses and mules not being well cared for. We'd seen that information before the trip and got a chance to see lots of mules and horses up close, and we saw nothing of the sort. All the animals looked healthy, and the mules would either carry 2 hiking packs or 1 larger bag, which seemed pretty reasonable. The hike is steepest near the trailhead at the switchbacks. After about a mile of that, you've finished with the switchbacks and you're just walking downhill. After a couple of miles, you get to a dry river basin, and you follow that for several miles on a very gradual downhill. The hike in was harder than I expected. You're in the sun a lot, and I really wouldn't want to do this in the summer. The helicopter makes its round trip about every 25 minutes, so it's always passing you by, reminding you that you chose to hike. After walking along the basin for several miles, you turn left next to a river, and finally you're in the shade under the trees. Not long after that, you get to the village of Supai. This is the only picture we have of the village because just after this spot there are signs telling you not to take pictures of the village or of the people who live there. It looks like any other tiny village you might imagine, except that everything you look at makes you think, how did this get down here? After the town, you've still got 2 miles to the campground, but this is where the first waterfalls are. First, we stopped at 50-foot falls. After more than 10 miles, it was nice to get the packs off and get in the water for a bit. There's also new Navajo Falls you can hike upstream to, but I'm ashamed to admit I didn't even notice it until I got home and looked closely at this picture. Just before the campground is Havasu Falls, which you see from the trail. We planned a longer visit to Havasu Falls for the next day, but it's a quick hike down off the main trail and another chance to take the packs off for a few minutes. By this time, I'm pretty beat, but somehow Michelle still has plenty of energy. Finally, we made it to the start of the campground. If you have the mules bring your bags, this is where they leave them. The campground is about a mile long, along both sides of a creek. The campsites are pretty close together, but there are some trees and bushes for a little privacy. There are 3 sets of pit toilets, evenly spaced throughout the campground, but there's only one place to get water, and it's near the start. We were arriving later than most people, so we kept walking and walking to the back of the campground and finally found an open spot. Luckily, it also had a picnic table. It was on the far side of the creek, So every time we left the campsite, we had to cross a somewhat sketchy bridge. The water was only a couple of feet deep, but still, we didn't want to fall in. We set up the tent, and then it was time to make dinner. Since we carried our supplies in ourselves, we packed very lightweight food. An alcohol stove to boil water, tortillas, and dehydrated beans to make burritos. Not too bad for the backcountry. There are no trash cans at the campground, so you have to carry all your unused food back to the top of the canyon. Speaking of trash, you have to hang your food and your trash, or the enormous squirrels will get into it. The squirrels were so big, I thought they were small marmots or something, but they're not. They're just gigantic squirrels. Just as we were finishing dinner, it started to thunder and then rain, so we hurried to get everything in the tent. Luckily, the tent didn't leak on us, and in the morning we cooked a simple breakfast of oatmeal with some dehydrated fruit and, of course, coffee. Then it was time to head out to see some waterfalls. First, we headed to Mooney Falls, which is just past the end of the campground. In fact, the creek that all the campsites are on is what flows over the falls. From the trail, you get some great views of the falls, which are about 200 feet tall. To get to the bottom, though, you have to crawl through a couple of these caves, which are pretty easy. They're not so long that you can't see light at the other end, and there are steps carved into them. But then you have to climb down some ladders that are attached to the rocks, and I decided that was a little too much for me. Plenty of people do it, but I'm not much for heights, so we climbed back up, took a few more pictures, and decided to head over to Havasu Falls. Havasu Falls is about 100 feet tall, half the height of Mooney Falls, but it's still huge when you're standing near it. Unlike Mooney Falls, though, it's very easy to get to. Just walk down this path cut into the rocks and descend maybe 10 feet or so. Now that we've had a night to rest after the hike in, it's much more relaxing being at Havasu Falls. There's a little rock cave behind the falls, but the force of the waterfall looked and sounded very strong, so we didn't explore that area. That didn't stop some people, though. One of the great things about Havasu Falls is that the water flows into several small pools. Some of them are even in the shade. Even when there are a lot of people at the falls, you can find somewhere to relax. Just be sure to wear some type of shoes in the water because there are sharp rocks at the bottom. We stayed for quite a while, relaxed and had a snack, then decided to head back to the campsite. Back at the campsite, we set up our ultralight two-person hammock. Most of the campsites, including ours, are right on the creek, and there are plenty of trees for a hammock. Then it was time to cook dinner, and just in time, because once again there was a thunderstorm that cut our dinner short and had us hurrying into the tent. This one was really windy, but once again the tent held up like a champ and kept us dry. The next morning we packed up and headed out, hitting the trail at 7 a.m. The rain had made the dirt wet enough to not kick up like sand, but not so wet it was mud, and that made the hiking a little easier. Michelle kept us on a good pace, and we finally made it to the hilltop, and we were exhausted from the switchbacks leading up to it. Then, of course, we remembered we had parked about a mile away, so we had one final mile of road walk. Now, almost all the other cars who parked on the side of the road had left, and we were the very farthest car from the hilltop. But we finally made it. From the time we left the campsite, it took us about 4.5 hours to get back to the car. When I uploaded my hike to Strava, I discovered that the part of the hike from the village to the hilltop is a segment, and, well, I didn't exactly set a new record. After leaving the reservation, we headed a few hours over to Prescott, Arizona, where we rented an Airbnb to spend a few days somewhere with a few more modern amenities, showers, toilets, breweries, stuff like that. We even found some hiking trails just outside of town. We found a relatively flat 10-mile loop hike. It's pretty special to hike a loop instead of an out and back, so we hit the trail. It's so much easier when you don't have to bring all that camping gear. With just day packs instead of those heavy packs, it felt like we were flying. Unfortunately, one thing we didn't bring was a map. We missed a turn and didn't realize it for a while. We ended up turning this 10-mile loop into a 12-mile loop, but we still had a good time and even made it back in town in time for lunch at a brewery. After spending a few days in Prescott, it was time to head back to Phoenix and fly home, but we're already planning our next vacation.